Thank you so much, Terry. I'm really excited to be here today. Talking about this particular topic is very important to me. Um, I'm going to do a visual description of myself first for those who may be viewing um, and have different abilities. I am a brown-skinned, Black, non-binary femme. I have on bright yellow glasses and a lavender t-shirt. Behind me are white bookshelves with dolls such as Hello Kitty and Tigger. And I have a black and white sign behind me that says Black feminisms get us free. So I don't have a fancy presentation, unfortunately. I wanted to just kind of just talk about the intersections of race, disability, and policing, and how it's particularly very important to me because of where I live. So um, I am a neurodivergent, disabled person who has chronic illnesses, and I am on the spectrum, and I also have ADHD. In 2018, on May 14th, Marcus David Peters was murdered during a mental health. He was having a mental health crisis, and he was murdered by Virginia police officer Michael Nyantakyi. And the prosecutors had reviewed what happened and basically just said that they did what they were supposed to do. Um, Marcus David Peters' sister, Princess, was very upset about this, along with other folks in the Richmond area. And of course, we took to the streets, we took to the state capitol, and we made an effort to make sure that people understood that what happened to Marcus David Peters was not an isolated event, and that there is an issue with policing in the Richmond City area, but especially when it comes to those who are experiencing mental health crisis and also have disabilities. We tried to get House Bill 5043 passed, and it was titled the Mental Health Awareness Response and Community Understanding Services, or the Marcus Alert System. Although the bill was seen as something that would be beneficial for Virginia, it was watered down, of course. The things that were requested, especially by Princess, Marcus David Peters' sister, were overlooked, and it really did not put the onus on the police force when it came to how they interacted with people who were experiencing mental health crises. The reason why this is so important to me is because mental health illness has been something that has impacted most of the women in my family. I come from a long line of women in my family who have experienced schizophrenia, who have experienced bipolar disorder, and other mental health issues. And there have been instances where they have been treated poorly, not only by those in their community, but also the police as well. It is very important to me to speak to you all about Marcus David Peters, specifically here in Richmond, Virginia, where I'm located and where I'm from, because during the 2020 rising after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were killed, we turned the monument, the Robert E. Lee Monument, into the Marcus David Peters Circle. That is where we all came together and protested. Those who were not immunocompromised were out there. I was doing stuff digitally because I'm immunocompromised, so I couldn't technically be out there. But it was really powerful to see the community of Richmond come together to push back against police brutality, but to also reclaim a space that had been inherently violent due to the colonization of Richmond. So I wanted to talk a little bit about statistics before I jump into a resource that I was able to assist making at my last employment. So reports state that less than 15%, Black people make up less than 15% of the general population, and this was in 2018. And I do want to make it clear that there is a dearth in the literature of current statistics around race, disability, and policing. Just so you all know, I combed the internet, and the most current I found that talked about those three things was in 2021. And it wasn't an academic journal. It was a regular article that someone had written. So there is a dearth in the literature, which means that there is a lack of, I don't want to say a lack of researchers, but a lack of amplification of the research on these topics. So 27% of all arrests in the United States were Black people. Disabled people were almost 44% more likely to be arrested by the age of 28 than people without a disability. I am 34 years old. I think very deeply about the women in my family who have experienced policing and have been arrested because of their disability. Black disabled people are at an even higher risk of being arrested by the age of 28, so 55%, compared to white disabled people, which is 40%. We all know that Black people make up a disproportionate share of people who are in jails, prisons, and also community corrections. We also know that these facilities do not have the proper tools and resources in place to help folks who need the assistance they need. One thing that I always tell my family, because I am an organizer here in Richmond, I focus a lot on reproductive justice, and I'm an abortion doula. And as you all know, abortion doulas are currently being scrutinized and looked at, and even some are being arrested. Is that if I was to be arrested as a disabled person, I would not last very long in jail because I would not have access to the things that I need on a day-to-day basis to be able to function. I may not have access to my psychotropic medications. I may not have access to my monthly injection medications for my rare skin illnesses. I may not have access to certain body washes that I have to use that are medicated for my rare skin illnesses. And I also may not have access to proper therapy and psychiatric help that is provided to me by someone who looks like me. About 1 in 4 Black people in state and federal prisons report having a disability, and about 1 in 3 Black people in jail report having one. Even though a lot of folks with disabilities, especially in the Black community, go unidentified or may be self-diagnosed, there is still a disparity, and there is still racial discrimination that happens to those who are disabled or even just seen as disabled, right? The Sandra Bland Act, and Sandra Bland, for those that don't remember, was in police custody, and I say that she was murdered. The police would say otherwise. She was a Black woman. She was also one of my sorority sisters, and they had intended to make it seem like her mental health was the reason why it led to her dying by suicide in the jail. And the Sandra Bland Act in particular was intended to address both mental health and criminal legal system practices rooted in systemic racism. So they were looking at things such as police stops and searches, racial profiling, and arrests for offenses punishable by fines. But ultimately, the provisions that sought to address these systemic racisms were stripped and thus failed to recognize Bland's intersectional identities. Sounds very familiar to what they did to House Bill 5043 for Marcus Alert, right? We create these bills that are inclusive of the people who are experiencing policing, right, to the people who have disabilities, and these bills are watered down and stripped of the very things that are important, such as their intersectional identities. So I had the pleasure when I was working as the director of communications for Me Too International to create a safe haven toolkit with Movement for Black Lives around their People's Response campaign. And their People's Response campaign is a major initiative to further the vision of the BREATHE Act at the local, federal, and electoral levels. They have brought 20 organizations from across the country together, committed to a vision as their public response campaign fellows. And these folks are working together to build Black political power at all levels to get us closer to a safer and freer future. The core component of their work is to campaign for resolutions in their cities for a non-police community wellness first response system. So in the Safe Haven Toolkit, which you can find on, it should be on the Me Too website and also on Movement for Black Lives, M4BL. The Safe Haven Toolkit has different resources, it has different definitions, it has access to different information to explain the process of having a non-police community wellness first response system, specifically for folks who may be experiencing a mental health crisis. And the purpose of us collaborating with M4BL when I was working for Me Too was that we wanted to make sure that people who are also survivors of sexual violence, who may be disabled or may be experiencing a mental health crisis, were treated fairly, right? And that they were experiencing proper care, and they were also being listened to, and that they were not being gaslit, right? But the main thing is we did not want them to be killed, right? That was the main purpose of us coming together, is that we did not want survivors of sexual violence and just survivors of any violence in general who are disabled and who may in that moment be having a mental health crisis to be murdered at the hands of the state because of policing. So I leave you all with this. Everyone knows someone who is disabled. They may not be someone that you're close to, or they may be someone that you are close to, but everyone knows someone who has a disability. Everyone knows someone who has had a moment of despair, depression, a mental health crisis. When you are thinking about policing, when you are thinking about race, when you are thinking about identity, I really want you all to take away from what I'm talking about the idea that we cannot enact change if we continue to water down the bills, policies, laws, and programs that prioritize intersectional identities to make police comfortable. It is time to make police uncomfortable enough that they realize that they are not treating people fairly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Give me a second while I share my slides here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. First of all, good morning, good afternoon. I'm in Arizona, so it's still morning for me over here at 10. My name's Danielle Wallace. I'm an associate professor of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. And I want to just start by thanking Terry and Dr. K for inviting me out to speak today. It's really wonderful to be a part of this workshop and working group. And this too is a topic that's near to my heart, as most everybody in my family is neurodivergent, including my son. And this has been doing research in this area has been a labor of love and a little bit of me search, because I want my son to be able to be comfortable out there in society. So let me just break down a really quick outline here for you. I'm going to touch upon the disability and race overlap, how society and both policing kind of shapes that overlap, and then showcase some research in the area that's my research that has tried to fill this hole that Dr. K has talked about regarding the information in this area, and then talk about some ways to move forward. Okay, so Dr. K already mentioned this, but what do Sandra Bland, Eric Gardner, Freddie Gray, Tanisha Anderson, Deborah Danner, Ezel Ford, Alfred Olongo, and Keith Lamont Scott have in common? Very simply, they're all disabled Black persons who died at the hands of the police or in police custody. They all have these similar issues of coming to the police or engaging with the police, and the result was them being killed. So, where does this overlap occur from the statistics, right? Uh, Again, as Dr. K said, there's not a lot of information that intersects these spaces that's official information. Very few states collect information on disability during police encounters. Race is much more commonly collected, but not disability. So it's really hard to know the kind of the depth of this problem outside of the things that we see in the news media. But here's some information. Between 33 and 50% of all people who are killed by the police are disabled. Um, we know 1 in 4 adult population in the US is disabled. And then disabled people are 2 times more likely to experience serious or fatal use of force. And by serious use of force, I mean hands-on batons, tasers, impact weapons. And fatal use of force is typically those that, obviously are fatal: guns, cartoid vein holds, and things like that. Fatal police shootings of people of color are 1.5 to 4 times higher than whites, depending on which race we're talking about. Um, and for a Black person, they're 5 times more likely to be stopped by the police without a just cause as a white individual. So I want to talk a little bit about this overlap from a societal perspective, and then we'll talk about it from a police perspective. We all know that both people of color and disabled individuals are stigmatized, right? We know what those stigmatizations are, what those stereotypes are. You have the common dangerous young Black male, assumptions of intellectual inferiority or lower capacity, assumptions about cultural inferiority that happen to people of color. Now, these are different depending on the individual's race and ethnicity, but these are kind of the underlying themes that occur across all of the ways in which people of color are stigmatized in the US. And not too uh, uh, not too surprisingly, the stigmatization of disabled individuals appears differently, but some of those same themes pop up, right? The idea of intellectual inferiority or lower capacity or capability. You have assumptions of state dependency, whether they deserve the resources that they're getting. They might have unpredictable behavior, particularly surrounding mental illness. People don't know how to read that behavior because it's not, air quote, typical. And that becomes scary to our society. And then disabled individuals become a protected class. And this might sound positive, but it manifests in a very negative way. And I'll give you an example of that, how that protected class pops out as for sexual assault victims, which is, why would anybody rape a disabled woman, for example? So when that assumption of nobody would rape a disabled person, this is a protected group, that's silly. What happens is victims aren't believed and their needs are unheard. And Dr. K also mentioned this as gaslighting victims, and this is exactly what happens. From a public perspective, you end up where we've created a kind of current culture where it's a see something, you say something kind of perspective, where people are calling the police and engaging the police when they're uncomfortable but not threatened, which is problematic, right? You should be calling the police when you're threatened, when you're in danger, not because you're uncomfortable with who you're around. Um, and then there's this assumption of deservingness for both people of color and disabled individuals, that they have to prove their value, that they have to prove and justify their presence. From the policing side, these things overlap. Um, we have issues of over policing, right? You end up with high crime areas, you have more policing, but high crime areas also suffer for hundreds of years at this point in time of institutional racism, on behalf of state and local governments, failure to provide resources, and basically a culmination and a focusing of social ills in places, and this is particularly in cities. So when it comes to over policing, it's ultimately policing poor people in poor places, places that have been radically neglected on behalf of the government. And while the police need to go in and address crime to some extent, the how it's happening is atrocious and needs some sort of change. Um, Additionally, from the policing angle, disability and cultural sensitivity training aren't that common. Disability trainings are relatively rare. I've seen some trainings about autism, but the autism trainings that I have seen are not haven't been tested. They haven't shown if they're affected and we effective, and we don't know whether they actually change police behavior in the field. Um, Implicit bias training for police officers is really common. It's commonly used whenever they have a critical incident involving race, but those implicit bias trainings don't necessarily get evaluated for whether they change behavior. In fact, recent research shows that in New York City, it actually caused problems and did damage and created more implicit bias than make it better. So the training that's available or the training that's not available is not helping the situation whatsoever. And then finally, um, policing infantilizes disabled people, and it's similar to treating people of color as incompetent, right? Both groups are not treated as fully functioning adults in the eyes of the state police, state and local police. Um, they are treated as needing intervention, needing assistance in a very kind of paternalistic way. What are the consequences? So, with this background in hand, I want to talk through some of the impacts this has for disabled people who are also people of color. And this is my research now. This is some of the work that I did focusing on autism. And the quotes that I have here are parents who have children who are on the spectrum, who are people of color, and how they talk about fearing police contact for their child. And I won't read all of them, but I'll just point out a couple of interesting ones. So the first one is he's a high functioning 18-year-old, large black male, and it seems that if he were stopped by the police and didn't comply quickly enough, police are more likely to shoot first and ask questions later. Um, and then I'll read another short one since, of course, I'm being sensitive to time. As a non-normative, racialized boy, I'm afraid his behavior would be misread, not given the benefit of a doubt. Now, these are all similar fears that white parents have, but white parents are not invoking race as something that puts them at this double disadvantage with the police. In fact, look at this last quote. Race did actually come up for white people, and it came up in a way that is not necessarily what was expected, which is being a white male professor means I can be accepted as eccentric but harmless to most authority figures. So they're recognizing their race as a privilege, even though they're disabled, um, when it comes to engaging with the police. So next, again, to harp on something that both Dr. K and I have talked about, there's this complete lack of information about contact with the police for disabled people who are also people of color. So this intersectional space is really rare to see in statistics. California is one of the few states that legislates that the police, any police department that has a law enforcement officer, has to collect information on disability. Now, there's a caveat about this data, and that is it's all officer perceived, right? So if the officer thinks you're disabled in some way and they'll check off which disability it is, then that goes into the record. The officer can get it wrong, and the officer may not see invisible disabilities, like anything that falls under the neurodivergent bucket. Those are often missed. So that being said, I want to show you some research on discretionary stops. And we focus on discretionary stops when we're talking about any type of bias in policing, because these are stops the officers can choose to make, right? There's no reason to contact you, right? Outside of there's something about the stop, like maybe you blew a stop sign. They don't have to pull you over if you blew a stop sign, but they can, right? So these are all discretionary stops on their behalf. These are the races that show up in the San Diego Police Department data, and I focused on San Diego Police Department because that's the I work with this data frequently, so it was very easy for me to look at this. And what we see here is that uh, the bulk of stops by race are not of disabled people, right? Oh no, no, go back. Okay, there we go. The bulk of stops are not of disabled people, but there are just differences across race. In particular, American Indians in San Diego have the highest percentages of disabled person stops, right? That's at 6%. And blacks and whites are the next highest groups at just over 3%, with blacks at 3.818% and whites at just 3.04%. So moving forward, I'm going to focus on those three groups: Blacks, American Indians, and whites. Now, this is super important. When we look at the reason for why the person was stopped among Blacks, American Indians, and whites, was almost 100% reasonable suspicion. The green bars are reasonable suspicion. The purple bars are traffic violations, right? So people are getting stopped for traffic violations, generally the same amount. Blacks, 9, almost 10%. American Indians, 12%. Whites, about 9.5%. So it's very similar across groups. But reasonable suspicion across all these groups are also similarly high. So 90% of all stops among disabled Black people are for reasonable suspicion. 88% of disabled American Indians are for reasonable suspicions, and 90.6% of all stops for whites who are disabled are for reasonable suspicion. So there's something about disability that really taps into officers' suspicions about criminality. This is kind of a jumble of things, but I wanted to focus on these bars with the purple numbers. So it's hard to say that the police are being biased without looking at stop outcomes as well. Just from a statistical standpoint, there's plenty of evidence that the police can be biased. Um, so from a statistical perspective, I look at the outcomes by these different races. And for American Indians, they are the group that's most American Indians who are disabled, they're most likely to be arrested. And they have the highest percentage of people who are going for a non-custodial or caretaking psychiatric transport. Now, these transports, right, so that's 40% of them. These transports can be voluntary or non-voluntary. I wasn't able, unfortunately, to differentiate between the two. And then looking over here, we have Blacks have the highest percentage of getting field interview cards. So what's a FI card, right, or a field interview card? It's basically a little piece of information that officers can collect about the stop or the individual in a stop. Now, having done some interviews with police officers, I know that if they have regular contact with somebody, say with autism, they might create a little FI card saying, you know, Ed really, really likes trains. So if you want to get in with him, talk to him about Thomas, the train, or something like that. But FI cards can also be plenty of other things, like, I think they're in this gang. Ultimately, it's a piece of data that only the police can see, that is about monitoring that individual or location. And we don't necessarily have access to that. So there's a lot of collected information about Black people who are disabled, and whites come in next at just close to 23%. Okay, so that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but let me talk quickly about what some things that we might be able to do, and these might come up in the working sessions. The first thing is police collect the data, right? You can't manage what you don't measure. If we don't have information about this, we can pretend it doesn't exist, right? Again, to Dr. K's points about things being watered down, we need to collect intersectional information because we're missing out about what's happening writ large with disability in general in policing. California did that through legislation. It was called the RIPA Act, and it stood for Racial Identity Profiling Act, right? So it's possible, but again, there's difficulties in doing that. Police, train your officers and change policies, right? Training may or may not work, but one of the things we know that does work with police officers is clear policies and clear guidance. When use of force policies are very, very clear and prescriptive rather than discretionary, allowing the police to choose the level of force that they use, inappropriate uses of force go down, right? So if police departments tell their officers what to do more frequently, it can control use of force. Additionally, the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, applies to policing activities. Police departments should be prescriptive in helping their officers know how to accommodate individuals with disabilities and what to do. Both of these policies, just use of force, for example, and what to do in a situation involving somebody with a disability, if departments were prescriptive, that could really help the situation that we find ourselves in with disability and policing and race. Police officers and police departments need to inspect their biases, both at the individual level and at the institutional level. There's some interesting research coming out of the University of Chicago. That's a cognitive behavioral therapy training that teaches police officers to inspect the biases that they bring to encounters. One of the very interesting presentations I saw about this was the author of the training showed a video where a police officer was shouting at a man running down the street to stop, and eventually caught the man, and the man didn't stop, right? He eventually caught the man, grabbed him, spun him around, right? Touched him, used force, and found out the man was deaf, right? So they're assuming that the person was running away from the police and potentially engaged in criminal activities versus some other very simple explanation about why the individual wouldn't stop. So this type of training should be on the table for officers. Next, the public needs to inspect their biases, right? One of the things that struck me when talking about coming to this Strategies for Justice Symposium and speaking was Terry mentioned that the public can increase the touch point of the criminal justice system because people will often call 911 when they're uncomfortable, right? Not necessarily when there's a threat. So the public should be thinking also as well about what their role is for expanding these touch points. Next, I would encourage parents of disabled children to borrow tactics from families of color who have taught their children how to interact with the police, and develop some of those strategies themselves, and think about it from an intersectional space as well. And then finally, for the public, connect, neighbor, don't create a cul-de-sac of social groups where everybody's the same. If we're going to change how the public perceives this, change how people are willing to get involved in local problems, if we're going to stop relying on the police, which is what we ultimately want, we need to start relying on ourselves. And that's going to be very difficult if we aren't willing to engage with each other. So I'll stop there and we'll turn it over to our working groups.